He pressed the send button the way a man does when he has already rehearsed the conversation a dozen times in his head and believes, with absolute certainty, that he has won before it has even begun. The invitation had taken him 3 drafts, not because he struggled to find the words, but because he wanted them to land precisely right. Warm enough to seem generous, specific enough to sting. "You meant a lot to this journey," he had written in the final version, "and it wouldn't feel complete without you there." He had shown it to his assistant, Priya, who had read it twice without expression, and said only, "It's clear." He had taken that as approval. His name was Harlan Bouchard, 44 years old, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Mercer & Holt, a mid-sized financial consulting firm with offices in downtown Toronto and a satellite location in Calgary that nobody talked about. He wore well-fitted suits and had the kind of handshake that left an impression, which he knew and cultivated. He had a fiancée named Audrey, 31, Pilates instructor, second-generation French-Canadian, very blonde, who had redecorated his Rosedale condo with a confidence that suggested she had been planning it for years before they met. The wedding was booked at the Balmoral, a restored heritage venue near the waterfront, on a Saturday in late October, when the maples would be turning, and the light on the lake would be the kind that made photographers request dawn slots. The invitation he sent that evening was not to Audrey's family. It was to his ex-wife. Her name was Toyin Obasi, though she had gone by Toyin for as long as anyone who mattered had known her, and she had legally hyphenated Reed when they married 11 years ago. She had stopped using it the day she signed the separation papers, without ceremony, without announcement. She had simply become Toyin Obasi again, as though the intervening decade had been a coat she had hung up and was not going to need anymore. Harlan had framed the invitation in his mind as a gesture of maturity. That was the word he used when he mentioned it to his groomsmen, his university friend Desmond and his work colleague Felix, over drinks at a Queen Street bar the week before the event. "It's a maturity thing," he said, swirling the last of his bourbon. "She was part of the chapter. It closes cleaner if she's there to see it." Desmond had agreed immediately, which was what Desmond did. Felix had taken a long sip of his beer and asked, neutrally, "Does she know it's a wedding invitation?" Harlan had said of course she did. It was printed right there on the card, and Felix had nodded and looked at his glass. What Harlan did not say, in that bar or anywhere else, was the image he returned to when he thought about October. Toyin, sitting somewhere near the back of the room at the Balmoral, in whatever she wore these days, watching him say vows to Audrey, while the chandelier light fell across the room and the jazz quartet played something tasteful, and everyone who mattered stood on his side of the equation. He wanted her to witness it, not cruelly, he told himself. As a conclusion, a formal punctuation mark on a story that she had, in his private version of events, failed to fully appreciate while it was happening. He was aware, in some dim and seldom visited corridor of himself, that this version of events was incomplete. He did not visit that corridor often. Toyin received the invitation on a Tuesday afternoon in September. She was in a meeting when it arrived. A strategy session with 4 of her senior engineers and a venture partner from a firm in Vancouver who had flown in specifically to discuss the 3rd phase of their infrastructure build. She did not look at her phone during meetings, a rule she had held for 9 years and attributed to being the only person in most rooms who could not afford the distraction of appearing distracted. After the meeting, she walked to her office on the 16th floor of the Obasi Technologies building, a building that bore her name on the directory and her initials on the founding charter, and sat down and looked at the email from his assistant, which contained a scanned image of the card, cream-colored, embossed, with the Balmoral's logo in the corner. She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the desk and looked out at the city below, where the afternoon light was doing something beautiful over the lake that she would not have seen if she hadn't been sitting exactly where she was. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the apartment they had shared in Parkdale, when neither of them had anything. The radiator that clanged at 3 in the morning, the kitchen table that was also her desk, The way she used to spread her coding work across one end, and he would eat his cereal at the other end and call her brilliant, like it was an observation he had just made and was pleased to report. She thought about the years after that, when things shifted in the way that things shift in long marriages, not dramatically but gradually, the way a house settles, almost imperceptibly, until one day a door that used to close flush no longer does. She thought about the moment, 6 years into the marriage, when she had pitched Obasi Technologies to her first investor. Harlan had been promoted at Mercer and Holt that same month. He had come home that evening with champagne, and she had tried to tell him about the meeting. And he had talked about his promotion for most of dinner, and she had decided that it was fine, that there would be other evenings. There had been other evenings, but somehow the telling always shifted, and the listening always shrunk, and eventually she stopped bringing the company up at home, because it was easier than watching him receive it, the way he received things that did not directly involve him, politely, and from a distance. The divorce had been civil. That was the word everyone used afterward, even people who had not been present for any of it. Very civil. Harlan got the condo in Rosedale, which he had wanted more than she had. She got the company, which she had not needed him to give her, because it had always been hers in every way that mattered. They had no children. The paperwork took 4 months. She had cried once, on a Saturday morning in February, sitting on the floor of the new apartment she had rented in Leslieville. Not because she missed him specifically, but because she had suddenly understood that she had been lonely inside that marriage for longer than she had been willing to admit. She had not cried about it since. She picked up her phone and typed a reply, "Thank you for the invitation. I'll be there." She pressed send before she could think about it further, which was a technique she had developed for decisions she had already made before she started analyzing them. Then she called her head of operations, a steady and observant woman named Chiamaka, who had been with her since year 2, and said, "I'm attending an event in late October. I'll need the full security detail." Chiamaka paused for exactly 1 second. "Personal or professional?" "Personal," Toyin said. "Full detail. I'll arrange it." Toyin put the phone down and returned to the window. Outside, a crane on a construction site 6 blocks east was swinging something heavy and slow through the open sky. She watched it complete its arc, and then she opened her laptop and went back to work. Obasi Technologies had been incorporated in Toronto 9 years ago, with $73,000, 2 junior developers, and a contract with a mid-sized logistics company in Mississauga that needed its inventory system rebuilt from scratch. Toyin had written the original code herself, working through nights in the Leslieville apartment after the divorce, sustained by instant coffee and the specific clarity that arrives when a person has nothing left to protect but the work itself. By year 3, the company had 12 employees and 4 enterprise contracts. By year 5, it had expanded into AI-assisted supply chain management and taken on a Series B round of $38 million. By year 7, Obasi Technologies had offices in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, a partnership with a federal infrastructure agency, and a team of 211 people who called Toyin's open door policy something between a gift and a mild disruption to their productivity, because she was genuinely interested in what everyone was doing. By the time Harlan's wedding invitation arrived on her phone, the company had just completed a fiscal year with revenues of $412 million. A profile in the Globe and Mail the previous spring had called Toyin one of the most significant tech entrepreneurs to emerge from Toronto in a generation. A CBC documentary in which she had participated briefly and reluctantly had attracted enough attention that her communications team now fielded media requests on a weekly basis, which she mostly declined to attend. She was not famous in the way that sought attention. She was known in the way that happens when the work itself becomes too large to be ignored. She had not mentioned any of this to Harlan. They had not spoken since the divorce finalized, except once, briefly, at a mutual friend's birthday gathering 3 years prior, where they had exchanged approximately 4 sentences about the food and parted without incident. She had assumed he knew. The way people, in a shared city, eventually know things about each other. Whether he had registered the scope of it was something she had never particularly wondered about. She wondered about it now, briefly, and then decided it did not change anything. The morning of the wedding was cold and clear, the way October in Toronto sometimes offers as compensation for the gray that follows. Toyin was up at 5:30, which was her usual time, and she spent the early hours the way she usually did, reviewing operations reports, responding to a flagged message from her Vancouver team about a software deployment issue, making coffee in her kitchen with the kind of focus quiet that she had come to understand was not loneliness, but simply the texture of a life built on her own terms. At 8, Chiamaka arrived with the security briefing. The lead detail for the day was a man named Garrison, calm, former RCMP, professionally invisible, and he walked through the plan with the economy of someone who had done this enough times that thoroughness no longer required elaboration. 2 additional members would accompany them in the second vehicle. Toyin would arrive at the Balmoral at 4:15, remain for the ceremony and the first portion of the reception, and depart no later than 7, at Toyin's discretion. "Do you want a cover story?" Chiamaka asked. She said it without inflection, which was one of the things Toyin appreciated about her. "For what? For why you're there." Toyin considered this for a moment. "No," she said, "I don't need one." She wore black, not as a statement, though she was aware it would be read as one. She wore it because it was the color she wore when she wanted to take up space without asking permission, a distinction she had worked out for herself years ago and never fully explained to anyone. The dress was simple, architectural, the kind that had been made for her by a designer in Montreal who understood that what Toyin needed from clothing was not decoration, but precision. She put on small diamond earrings that had been a gift to herself after the Series B closed, and she did not wear a necklace. She looked at herself in the mirror for approximately 4 seconds, which was about 3 seconds longer than usual. And then she picked up her bag and went downstairs. The Balmoral sat close enough to the waterfront that you could smell the lake when the wind came off it, which it did that afternoon, cool and clean and faintly mineral. The venue had been restored with the kind of care that preserved its original bones. High ceilings, arched windows, wide plank floors, while adding the infrastructure that modern weddings required. Toyin had been inside it once before, years ago, at a charitable gala, and she remembered thinking it was a beautiful room that knew what it was. The vehicles pulled into the side entrance at 4:17. Garrison came around to open her door before she reached for the handle, which she had never fully adjusted to, and suspected she never would. The second detail fell into position. Unhurriedly, professionally, the way people trained for this moved, which was like water finding the shape of the space without making a sound about it. She walked toward the entrance. She was aware of the moment she became visible to the people gathered outside the main doors. A cluster of guests in formal wear, a photographer adjusting his lens, 2 of the venue staff standing near the canopy with clipboards. The awareness came not from any change in herself, but from the change in the air around her. A pause. The particular quality of a pause that happens when something enters a field of view that doesn't quite fit the frame people were holding. Someone said something to someone else in a low voice. The photographer's lens swung toward her involuntarily, and then corrected itself. Toyin walked through the doors. Harlan was standing near the interior entrance to the ceremony hall when she arrived, and the expression that crossed his face was not the one he had rehearsed. He had imagined this moment with a certain composition in mind. Toyin at the periphery, perhaps slightly uncertain, perhaps dressed in something that would look earnest and slightly behind. What he had not imagined was the quality of stillness that she brought into the room, or the detail of the men flanking her entry, unhurried, formal, conspicuously present. He recognized one of them. He was not entirely sure from where, but the recognition carried a particular quality. The kind that arrives when someone who belongs to a world you circulate near appears in a context that reveals how far from that world you actually stand. A woman beside him, the mother of a Mercer and Holt colleague, who had made a career of being socially observant, leaned slightly toward her companion and said quietly, "Is that the Obasi woman?" Her companion said, "I think so." The first woman said nothing further, but her posture adjusted in the way that people's postures adjust when a calibration is required. Harlan had heard the name Obasi Technologies in passing. He had perhaps read a headline or caught the tail end of something on the radio driving in from Rosedale. He had absorbed it the way a person absorbs peripheral information, incompletely, without assignment, filed somewhere low. He had not made the connection to the woman who had once eaten cereal at the other end of the kitchen table and called him from Pearson Airport when she was running late and needed him to start the pasta. He made it now. A sensation moved through him that he could not have named without more honesty than he was prepared to access in a room full of people in formal wear. He raised a hand in greeting, which came out smaller than he intended. Toyin saw it and nodded once. Not coldly, not warmly, simply clearly, and moved toward the seating area with the ease of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Desmond appeared at Harlan's shoulder and said, "Is that your?" And Harlan said, "Yes," and Desmond said nothing else. The ceremony was 35 minutes long. Audrey was beautiful and visibly nervous in the way that people are nervous when they have planned something extensively and are now experiencing it actually happening. The officiant spoke about partnership and growth and the choice to build something together. The words were good words. Harlan said his vows with feeling. Audrey said hers with her voice breaking on the last sentence, which made several guests reach for the small folded tissues that the Balmoral had placed discreetly at each chair. Toyin sat 3 rows from the back. She was still. She watched the ceremony with the attention she brought to things that required attention, which was the same quality whether she was watching a board presentation or a sunset or this. Her ex-husband marrying a woman who was not her, in a room that was very beautiful, on a day when the light outside was the particular gold of late October in this city. She had thought, in the days leading up to this, that she might feel something she would need to manage. What she felt instead was something closer to clarity, the specific sensation of understanding, without remainder, that a chapter is behind you. Not painfully, simply completely. She did not think about the radiator that clanged in the Parkdale apartment. She did not think about the kitchen table, or the cereal, or being called brilliant from across the room. She thought, briefly, about the $73,000 and the 2 junior developers and the logistics company in Mississauga. And she felt something in her chest that was not sadness, but was the closest thing she had to tenderness for the version of herself who had built everything from exactly that. Then the ceremony ended, and the room shifted into the warm noise of a reception beginning. The shift happened in the way that shifts at events like this happen, gradually, then all at once. It began at the cocktail reception, during the portion where guests were moving, between the bar and the terrace and the clusters of white linen tables. A man approached Toyin near the window, older, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in a room where his opinions carried weight and had arranged his posture accordingly. His name was Douglas Firth, and he was on the board of a pension fund that had been in quiet conversation with Obasi Technologies' institutional partnerships team for the better part of 8 months. He extended his hand with genuine warmth. "Toyin Obasi," he said, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Small city," she said, which was the most she offered. He introduced her to the couple beside him, a woman in charcoal silk who turned out to be a federal deputy minister, and her husband, who had spent 30 years in municipal infrastructure and knew every major capital project in Ontario by its cost overrun. Within 4 minutes, the conversation had moved, naturally, into the territory of Obasi Technologies' recent federal partnership, and then into the infrastructure AI work that Toyin's team had been developing for the past 18 months, and then into a question the deputy minister raised about procurement timelines that Toyin answered with the precision of someone who had been living inside that data for a quarter. Garrison stood 6 feet away, unhurried and present. A cluster of other guests began to drift toward the conversation, the way people at events drift toward the source of energy. Some of them recognized Toyin directly, from the Globe profile, from industry circles, from the CBC piece that had aired 9 months ago. Others recognized her from the quality of the conversation itself, the specific authority of someone who is not performing knowledge, but simply has it. By the time the caterers began moving people toward the dining hall, there were 11 people in the conversation near the window, and the conversation had expanded to include the deputy minister's colleague from finance, two venture partners who had been seated near the back during the ceremony and had been wondering since 4:15 who Toyin was, and a journalist who was there as a guest of the groom's college acquaintance, and who had, by now, confirmed on her phone the revenue figure she had been trying to remember since she first saw Toyin walk in. Felix, standing near the bar, watched all of this with the expression of a man who had asked a question at the right moment and was watching the answer unfold in real time. Desmond watched it too, though with less comprehension and more confusion, which was also typical. Harlan stood near the gift table with Audrey's hand in his and watched the room orient itself around his life without appearing to do anything at all to cause this, and something moved through him that was too complex and too true for the context. And so he set it down and picked up a glass of champagne instead. The toasts came after dinner. Desmond spoke first, warmly, with the specific affection of a man who has known someone since before they became the version of themselves they present to the world. He told a story about Harlan in university that made people laugh. He raised his glass. People raised theirs. Then the best man, Felix, who had been asked to speak second, stood up with his champagne and said, "I've known Harlan for 17 years, and I can tell you, with complete honesty, that he is a man who knows how to recognize an opportunity." A pause. "The question that has always interested me is whether he recognizes it before or after it becomes obvious." There was laughter that had a slightly different quality to it. Felix continued with something warm and concluded properly and sat down, and if Harlan registered the particular precision of what had just been said, his expression did not show it, or perhaps it showed it in the small muscle along his jaw that tightened briefly and then released. Toyin had not been asked to speak. She had not expected to be. But during the toast segment, a woman across the table, the deputy minister's assistant, who had been introduced to Toyin during the cocktail hour, leaned over and said quietly, "I just want to say, what your team built for the infrastructure pilot, my office has been talking about it for weeks. It's genuinely extraordinary work." "Thank you," Toyin said. "Tell me what's been most useful, and I'll pass it to the team. They built it." The woman said, "Does your founder's credit make you uncomfortable? Because it really should be yours." Toyin considered this. "I built the conditions for the team to build the thing," she said. "That's the part that's mine." The woman nodded slowly, as though she was going to be thinking about that for a while. Harlan found her near the end of the evening, on the terrace that overlooked the waterfront. He had been working toward this moment, she could tell, from the way he arrived, deliberate, with a glass in his hand that he did not particularly need but was holding anyway. The lake was dark and still. The last light had gone an hour ago, and the city reflected itself in the water in long orange and white lines. "Toyin," he said. "Harlan," she said. He stood beside her and looked at the water for a moment, which was the social equivalent of gathering himself. Then he said, "I didn't know. About the company. The size of it." "No," she said. "I know. I should have." She did not argue with this or console it. She let it stand where he put it. He said, after a moment, "You always said it was going to be something." "Yes," she said. "I thought it was just." He stopped. She waited, not unkindly. "I thought it was just something you said," he finished. There was a silence that was not hostile, but had the specific weight of things finally being said correctly, after a long time of being said wrong. Toyin held the stem of her glass and looked at the water. Somewhere across the city, a siren moved through the dark and faded. "It's a good evening," she said, which was true. He said, "I'm glad you came." She wasn't sure if she believed that he meant it the way he was saying it now, rather than the way he had meant it when he sent the invitation. but she also understood that people could move between versions of their intentions over the course of an evening, and that this version, humbler, more honest, with the quality of something actually meant, was the one that was worth receiving. "Congratulations," she said, and meant it cleanly, without residue. She set her glass on the terrace railing and turned to go inside, where Garrison was already in position near the exit. Kiyamaka had texted that the vehicles were ready. The night was cold and clean, and the lake smelled the way it always smelled in October. Like depth, like the particular generosity of a city that keeps offering you its water no matter what else has happened in it. She walked back through the beautiful room, past the tables with their spent candles, and the guests still gathered in the warm noise of the evening's end, past Audrey, laughing with someone near the bar, in the radiant, uncomplicated happiness of a woman who had just married the man she wanted. Past Felix, who caught Toyin's eye briefly as she crossed the room and gave a small nod that acknowledged something without naming it. She did not look for Harlan again. There was nothing left in that direction that she needed. Chiamaka was in the front vehicle when Toyin got in. She looked up from her phone and read Toyin's face with the efficiency of someone who has been paying attention for years. "How was it?" she asked. Toyin pulled her coat around her and looked out the window as the vehicles pulled away from the Balmoral and moved east along the waterfront, the lake dark and wide on the left and the city lit up on the right. "Fine," she said. And then, because Chiamaka had earned more than that, clarifying. Chiamaka nodded and went back to her phone. The drive back to Leslieville took 12 minutes. Toyin spent them looking at the city she had built her company in, which had not always been easy, and had not always been fair, and had offered her exactly what it offered everyone: a surface to build on, if you were willing to do the building yourself. She had been willing. She still was. She would be again tomorrow morning at 5:30, with the operations reports and the Vancouver team, and the coffee that she made in her kitchen in the particular quiet that was not loneliness but simply hers. The city held its lights against the dark water. She watched it until the car turned north and the lake disappeared behind the buildings. And then she took out her phone and began reading the morning's first briefing. Because there was still work to do, and she had always found the work, in the end, to be the truest answer to everything.